Hello everyone, and on behalf of ANROWS, I welcome you to today's webinar, Chuck on a Lie Detector, Investigating Australians' Mistrust in Women's Reports of Sexual Assault. My name is Padma Raman and I'm the CEO of ANROWS. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land across Australia on which we meet today and pay my deep respects to elders past, present and emerging. Wherever we are across Australia, we're on unceded Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land, and I acknowledge and pay respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. Today's webinar is a panel discussion followed by a live Q&A, so please send through your questions at any time during the course of the discussion, and we'll try and get to as many of them as we can. The research report and resources on the topic discussed today are available in the handout section of the webinar. And if you'd like to access closed captions, please click on the link provided in the chat box. The webinar will be recorded and will be available on the ANROWS website as soon as possible. You can subscribe to Notepad, our fortnightly e-newsletter, to be notified of when it's available. Finally, we have a survey that'll pop up as you exit the webinar. If you could take a couple of minutes to complete it, we'd really appreciate your feedback. Your responses will help us improve our webinar program. This is a confronting topic and some participants might find it distressing. It's important that you take care of yourself while watching this webinar. If you would like to access support, please contact 1-800-RESPECT, that's 1-800-737-732, or Lifeline on 13 11 14. So as many as 4 in 10 Australians mistrust women's report of sexual violence. This is according to a 2017 National Community Attitudes Towards Violence Against Women survey. This mistrust is in stark contrast to the fact that false allegations of sexual assault are extremely rare, and the vast majority of sexual assault in Australia remains unreported. Today, ANROWS launches Chuck on a Lie Detector, Investigating Australians' Mistrust in Women's Reports of Sexual Assault, a qualitative research study which explores the factors underlying this community mistrust in women's reports of sexual assault. The study employed a mixed method research design conducting 14 semi-structured online focus groups. The sample broadly reflected the age, geographic and cultural demographics of the Australian community. So let me now introduce you to our great panel. We have Kate Minter, who's the Senior Research Officer at ANROWS, who is a co-author of the report. We have Saxon Mullins, Director of Advocacy, Rape and Sexual Assault Research and Advocacy. We have Meena Singh, Senior Advisor at the Human Rights Law Centre. We have Dr. Emma Partridge, Manager of Policy and Evidence at Our Watch, and Heather Clark, former Manager of Northern Centre Against Sexual Assault and current board member of the National Association of Services Against Sexual Assault. Kate, I might start with you. Can you tell us why it's important to understand the community's mistrust of women's reports of sexual violence, and why did the research team choose this title?
Thanks, Padma. I just want to start by acknowledging the land I'm on today. I'm meeting on Gadigal land in the Eora Nation, and I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And as Padma mentioned, today we're releasing our report on mistrust of women's reports of sexual violence. So I want to acknowledge as well and thank the authors of the report with me, Dr. Erin Carlisle and Dr. Christine Kumalaris. And I also want to acknowledge those with lived experience of violence, particularly of those joining us today, and acknowledge that your stories of courage and resilience are what drive our work in this space. So why mistrust is important? As Padma pointed out, the NCAS had some concerning results about high levels of mistrust of women's reports of sexual violence in the community, and that they're out of step with those, the evidence that tells us that the overwhelming majority of allegations are made truthfully. Attitudes that women lie about sexual assaults are not supported by the evidence, but research has also found that not being believed has a huge impact on victims and survivors. It impacts whether they even recognise their experience as sexual assault, disclose their experience to friends or family, or make a formal report to the authorities. This in turn has an impact on health seeking, healing and justice outcomes. And again, as Padma noted, when it comes to reporting, assault happens often and it is reported infrequently. 1 in 5 women have reported experiencing sexual violence in their lifetime, and of this, around 9 in 10 women did not contact the police about their most recent experience of sexual assault. We need to understand why people mistrust women's reports of sexual assault, because they're not accurate beliefs and they're a big barrier to reporting. So that's why this research is so important, and a bit about what we found. Although we expected high levels of mistrust based on the findings of seen in a population survey, a qualitative study was also concerning and confronting in the results that it found. The report's findings can be summed up well in the title of the report, "Chuck Her on a Lie Detector." This is a quote from the participants in one of our male focus groups. The suggestion was offered by a participant after being presented with a woman's allegation of sexual assault and was met by laughter by other participants. This is an extreme and confronting representation of mistrust, but it really speaks to some of the key findings that we found in our research. Firstly, there is a general and concerning climate of mistrust. Women aren't directly called liars, but they're not trusted, and there's a default position to ask questions and mistrust what she's saying. The onus is placed on women to prove the legitimacy and veracity of their claims, and they're at times given unrealistic expectations of what they need to provide real evidence to prove that an assault took place. While some attention is placed on the accused, there is a spotlight on victims and survivors almost being put on trial themselves when they make an allegation. These all point to some very concerning things that we clearly need to address. Among the negative, though, there were also some positives. Although participants found a lot of reasons not to trust women, they also acknowledge the difficult position that women are placed in when they're making an allegation and trying to prove that their experience. Generally, first-person and detailed accounts provided by victims and survivors were seen as powerful and made an account more believable. Although this places a large and unfair burden on women to have to bear their stories and trauma in order to be believed, it also speaks to the incredibly powerful voices of survivors and advocates in shifting the conversation about sexual assault. So that's just a bit of a summary of some of the things that we found and a bit about why it's so important. Thanks, Padma.
Thanks, Kate. Really alarming. And Saxon, maybe if we could reflect a bit more on how this mistrust impacts on women reporting sexual assault. Why might survivors choose not to report, even if, according to this study, having a police report makes it more likely to be believed?
Yeah, it's really concerning. Like Kate, I'm coming to you from the Gadigal lands of the Eora Nation, and it's very confusing that we would hear this, that it makes it so much more believable when you have a police report, considering even participants in the study acknowledged how difficult it was to go to the police, to come forward and to go through the justice route. And so the fact that that would be seen as evidence that you might be more truthful than others is quite alarming. The reaction of the person who a victim first discloses to sets the tone for how they feel about their journey after that moment. So if you tell your story to someone for the first time and they are disbelieving, or they bring rape myths into it, which might be, oh, well, did you lead that person on, or what were you wearing? Those classic things that survivors are often asked. That can end a survivor's journey for justice right there. And not only their journey for justice, it could end them getting the help that they need, the support that they need. So the mistrust and the disbelief and the rape myths that are entrenched in all of that, that would stop someone from reporting straight away. And when we talk about reporting sexual violence and going to the police, there's so many reasons why a survivor would choose not to do that. First Nations women will not feel comfortable going from one violence of person to person to violence of the state. That's just not even going to be something that would be helpful to them. Lots of women don't see the justice system as justice. And so, you know, the fact that having this really high bar of what would be enough evidence for you to believe somebody is ridiculous. And it's also just a little bit of a cop-out, I think, to say, oh, well, if you'd gone to the police, I'd believe you, as if that's such an easy thing to do, just checking a box of going to the police.
Thanks, Saxon. Mina, would you like to reflect on that, on First Nations women and why they might not want to report?
Yeah, certainly. Just before I do, I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation here in Naarm in Melbourne, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and I do so as part of my cultural responsibilities as a Yorta Yorta woman. Yeah, as Saxon touched on, we see violence against First Nations women, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, on an individual level and also from the state, and that violence has been in place since invasion, has continued through many different state mechanisms, police being just one of those mechanisms. You know, the process of reporting something as traumatic as a sexual assault or a rape has all sorts of different layers in it. The first one obviously being about gender and sexual relations, but also you throw into reporting it usually as a race issue as well, that it's an Aboriginal woman who is making a report usually to a white police officer. And if the person who she's accusing is also white, there's a huge interplay of racism and a whole set of racist assumptions that come into how Aboriginal women are treated. And we see this whenever Aboriginal women report any sort of offending against them, whenever they're the victim. We see this play out in rape and sexual assault. We see it play out in family violence and other minor offences against them. Simply the police aren't seen as a place where Aboriginal women feel safe and where they can go to for help. And, you know, from past working experiences, working with the Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service, knew of cases where Aboriginal women had gone to report a rape but had basically been laughed at and told they weren't believed, that there was no point making the report because they wouldn't be believed in court. And then, you know, the only way you can get a decision like that looked at is if you complain to the police. So it's, you know, it's just such a problematic space for Aboriginal women with such a long historical overlay of racism and sexism. And quite simply, Aboriginal women are simply not seen as real victims the way that Aboriginal women are seen in terms of womanhood or femininity or all those sorts of things. They're not seen as a genuine victim to be pitied the same way that some other victims are seen.
Thanks, Mina. Kate, the study also did look at understandings of consent. Could you talk to us a bit about that?
Yes, sorry, Padma. So in our study, we looked at understandings of consent and how that affected mistrust in women's reports. So in our studies, participants were presented with two scenarios of hypothetical allegations of sexual assault. And through these, they discussed what sexual assault looked like and whether or not these scenarios met a definition of sexual assault. And sexual assault was discussed in the frame of consent around no means no, or a negative framing of consent. So when assessing a woman's allegation of sexual assault, they focused on what she did to refuse consent, how was it communicated, whether that she fought back, while noting that fight back injuries might make the case more believable. The real focus was on what she did to refuse consent. So this requirement, or this idea that consent is refused, is out of step with legal definitions of consent. Although legal definitions of consent vary across jurisdictions, they don't require physical fight back, and the consent laws generally refer to a free and voluntary agreement to take part in sex that requires the parties have a reasonable belief that consent has been provided. So this isn't about consent being refused. There's a positive, even in the law, while it needs to be improved, the legal requirements currently talk about consent being provided. In the study, this was not what participants were drawing on. Instead, the man accused of sexual assault did not have their actions around consent interrogated anywhere near to the degree that the woman in the story did. There was no explanation of what he'd done to ascertain or confirm consent, or no questioning around why he thought consent had been provided. The focus was purely on what she had done to refuse consent and to refuse it clearly. These perceptions were linked to mistrust, sometimes really obviously with questions like, was it really rape? And other times implicitly by just not focusing on what the accused had done or what his responsibilities around consent were. So this points to an opportunity for improved understandings of current consent laws, but as I think some of our other panellists can speak to in more detail, really talks about the need for improved consent laws and consistency around consent laws that clearly talk about the importance of affirmative consent, and that consent must be continuous and that it can be withdrawn and that it shouldn't just be assumed.
Thanks, Kate. That's the perfect point to bring Saxon in, who's been advocating for for consent law reform. Saxon, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Like Kate mentioned, so consent in all states around Australia, it basically comes down to meaning-free and voluntary agreement. But there, when you use, I think we do sometimes have to be very descriptive, because, just saying that sounds perfect. That's great. That is what, consent is. But we need extra factors involved in that. So under New South Wales law currently, a person commits sexual assault if they know the other person is not consenting, they are reckless as to whether they consent, or there is no reasonable grounds for believing that there was consent. And that's where we have those sort of grey areas of what I might consider reasonable as to what someone else might consider reasonable grounds. For example, in my own case, it was considered reasonable that even though I did not consent, that person thought I was, for whatever reason that might be. But so when you have those grey areas, that's where you have those issues arise. So there is currently a bill in New South Wales Parliament for exactly that, for those affirmative consent changes. So moving away from that no means no into a yes means yes. So affirmative consent basically means that consent is actively sought and actively given. And it is a conversation that is happening throughout a sexual act to make sure that, everyone is having a good time and wants to be involved. Having to legislate for something like that, I think, is really important, because when we leave those grey areas, when we leave those questions of, what you might think is reasonable or what I might think is reasonable, then we have, a situation like mine where the judge acknowledged that I was not consenting, but that person didn't know that. How can we have to be able to bridge that gap, because how is that possible that those two people are in the same scenario? And so, and I think it also lines up with just what we think as a society of how we engage in sex now at this time. And that is that affirmative. It's not just, those old ideals of did she push away, did she run, those really old-fashioned notions. But are you having a conversation? Are you engaged? Are you having a good time? So I think it's really important to bring, other states up to that gold standard. Currently just Tasmania has that, and it would be really great if everyone could get, in step with really what is societally the way that we should be engaging in sexual acts.
Thanks, Saxon. And I guess law reform takes time, but Heather, how do we change the conversation around consent?
Thanks, Padma. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on Wurundjeri land and also pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So sexual assault services strongly support the introduction of a nationally consistent definition of consent. I think one of the most important changes needed is for our language in speaking about consent to be as clear and consistent as possible. Sexual assault counsellors have been using the language of affirmative consent and enthusiastic consent for some time, but naming the three key components, communicative, affirmative and ongoing, in the way that this report does is very useful. Everyone working in health and community services, policing and justice needs to be clear about consent and able to explain what's expected in consensual sex so they can better support and respond to victim survivors. There's continuing lack of awareness within the community about what behaviours constitute sexual assault, and we see this in our work with some women from migrant and refugee backgrounds and some young people. And this lack of awareness, may relate to social conditioning about male entitlement to sexual gratification, or not recognising the part that coercion can play in sexual assault. Services need to provide clear information about sexual assault and consent in a variety of accessible forms, so multilingual and online information. And we really need age-appropriate consent education as part of respectful relationships education within schools. In particular, that education needs to challenge the key sexual assault myths and identify the key elements of consent, and specifically the address the effects of pornography, which is really influencing young men's behaviour, and promote an alternative sexual narrative of mutual respect, empathy and responsibility. And even as mentioned, although we have laws in some states that legislate for communicative, affirmative and ongoing consent, our clients' experience in court doesn't reflect this. So we need something else to change to ensure that courts actually apply the intent of their laws. We need the judiciary to act as positive role models for the community as part of challenging the current culture which scrutinises victims rather than perpetrators' behaviour.
Thanks, Heather. And you touched on prevention. Emma, can I go to you on that point, the importance of respectful relationships programs and other programs for young people?
Yeah, absolutely. And before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation on whose lands I am today, and note that that land has never been ceded, and pay my respects. Yeah, it's really important to touch on the issue of prevention. Thanks, Padma, because this research is so important to sort of identify the myths and misconceptions that are driving the mistrust of women's reports, because that is a way to improve the legal system, the response system, the justice system, and anybody who listens to women's reports, and increase the likelihood that they'll be believed and that they'll receive the support and the justice that they're looking for. But there's another perspective to this debate, and at our watch, obviously, we're focused on primary prevention and stopping this kind of violence from happening in the first place, so that women aren't seeking support and justice. And we look at what drives violence against women, and one of the things that's so interesting is that these kinds of attitudes and beliefs and myths and misconceptions, the gender stereotypes that this research is highlighting, are actually the drivers of violence against women in the first place. So they not only make it difficult for women to report and receive justice, but they are what's causing the culture and the social context that gives rise to violence against women in the first place. Because those ideas that that women are asking for it, or that men can't control themselves, or that consent is something she has to refuse rather than he has to obtain, are all part of the underlying gendered drivers and the gendered social context that gives rise to violence against women. And so, yeah, very much important in terms of primary prevention to be challenging those myths and misconceptions as a way of stopping this violence from happening in the first place.
Emma. Kate, do you want to unpack some of those myths that we've been talking about that the report looked at?
Yeah. Thanks, Emma. Because yes, we did find a lot of myths, misconceptions, and also some harmful stereotypes that really came out in the research. So firstly, starting, I guess, with some of these harmful stereotypes, a big one that came out was the idea that women have an ulterior motive to lie about sexual assault. And the two main ones that came out that have come up in research before is firstly, that women are out to get men and try and hurt them, and that women regret sex or are embarrassed about the sex that they had, and so lie about it and say that it wasn't consensual. So this first one, this idea that women were out to get men, was in response to women being hurt and then trying to get back at the men as a result. The idea of a scorned lover came up a lot. And women were just really painted as being malicious, scorned and bitter, which really feeds into damaging stereotypes around women generally as vindictive and nasty, and using sex as a weapon or a tool, which again are just stereotypes that are perceived in inaccurate information. The second that really was borne out was this idea that women regret sex or are embarrassed about sex that they've had that was consensual, and so therefore lie about that and say that it was non-consensual and that it was sexual assault, which again are feeding into some really damaging and inaccurate stereotypes of women, that they should be ashamed of casual sex, and that's something that could cause social damage that they need to then try and rectify by lying about a consensual act of sex. So these were motives that came up in our hypothetical scenarios that we discussed. Some of them, there was some kind of detail in the scenarios that were being discussed that made people want to come up with these ideas, but also participants seemed to just come up with motives to try and fill in the gaps behind why would someone say that they were raped. And so almost filling in the gaps of stories and pulling motives or ideas of why a woman might do something almost out of thin air, which was a concerning finding, but also just goes to show that, you know, there's this idea that there's a range of reasons one woman might want to lie, which just isn't supported by the facts. So it points to two things. Firstly, we need to address and correct problematic gender stereotypes that mistrust women, and obviously these kinds of stereotypes are also feeding into the violence that's taking place in the first instance, like Emma said. But this also points to the negative impact we have when we place women on trial and at the centre of an allegation. So in addition to perceptions around women having motives to lie, this is also interacting with a range of other interrogations of women's actions, behaviours and responses. Women who made a report of sexual assault were expected to respond in a way that really showed the seriousness of their allegation. And this meant that they were asked, you know, did she report to the police? Why didn't she report sooner? As Saxon mentioned earlier. But why doesn't she seem more upset? She doesn't seem upset, she seems angry. Angry is not an appropriate response. Many of these drew on common rape myths, and then also just interacted with the broader stereotypes as just like a interacting and snowballing reason for not trusting what women had to say. So yes, lots of really damaging stereotypes and myths that really need to be corrected.
And Mina, you talked about myths earlier around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. How do you think it plays out with victims who are First Nations women?
Yeah, it's you know, we often talk about colonisation as being something that happened only to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but obviously colonisation has positive impacts on settlers and their descendants and people who've come to Australia since. And part of the creation of Australia was built on sexist and racist stereotypes about Aboriginal men and women. You know, part of colonisation involves violence, sexual violence, assault. It's been a part of, I guess, the toolkit of any coloniser's way of invading and taking over. So for Aboriginal women, we've for a long time been victims of sexual assault and rape and have had to deal with the brunt of it. And you know, it's really interesting if you look at how so-called well-meaning people responded to, you know, Aboriginal women who were raped. Well, you know, it was always that, well, these women just need to learn to close their legs, or they just shouldn't be enticing men, or, you know, there's certain attitudes about how Aboriginal women are about being loose with morals and loose sexually. And these are the sorts of things that play into that idea that these women aren't victims and don't deserve to have the same protection of the law that other white women or other women are allowed to. And, you know, and there's similar, you know, other women of other backgrounds, you know, similarly seen as not woman enough to be protected. And these all really play into how, you know, from that first point of reporting that we talked about, how women's stories are believed, what they say, how they present, the trope of the angry black woman, of, you know, being damn angry about being sexually assaulted, and why shouldn't you be? It's, you know, but, you know, for what often a courtroom wants to see, or what a jury wants to see, what a jury wants to see that'll tie in with their views about, you know, what a victim should be. that sort of presentation doesn't work and doesn't align with those myths that Kate was talking about. And it's, you know, it really makes it difficult for Aboriginal women to firstly trust the supposed services that we're supposed to use the way that other people do. We simply don't see those services as safe. We don't see going to the police as safe. We don't see places like hospitals for reporting maybe for the first time as safe. You know, these are the sorts of places and services that were complicit rather in you know, removal of children or breaking up of families and such. So there's a whole historical interplay there that really impacts on Aboriginal women and what their experiences are. But the other side of it, and I think Heather touched on it in terms of using our judiciary as modelling good behaviour, modelling attitudes and such, is that we, you know, the police are a subset of society, of broader society. You know, judges are subsets of broader society, very privileged people, but still part of society. You know, if we've got these attitudes prevalent in society, they're simply going to filter through to those institutions, and they're going to have those same views that become part of their institutional, the structural racism and sexism that gets you know, reaffirmed. So you know, it's so important to have that multi-prong approach to these issues about changing those community views before we even get to a point of experiencing rape and sexual assault and then having to report it and then experience those community views all over again just through a specific legal lens.
Yes, Heather, we've heard that there's this expectation that women can, you know, recount accurately an experience of sexual assault to the police straight after it happens. From your experience, why is that unrealistic?
Thanks, Pam. I'd just like to say at the outset that sexual assault services believe it's vital that victims are able to access support from specialist sexual assault counsellors before they're asked to make decisions about proceeding with legal options. And in Victoria, we provide 24-hour crisis care, during which we explain the medical, forensic and legal and support options and provide advocacy then for what the victim survivor wants to happen. But to come to your question, you know, being interviewed by police can be really re-traumatising and confusing for anyone wanting to report a sexual assault, given the trauma they've experienced. It's an intense interaction, often lasting several hours, involving a lot of questions from police, hospital staff and forensic medical officers. We all respond differently to trauma, so victims will present differently. Some may appear completely shut down, others will be attempting to make sense of what's happening to them, remembering different parts of the sexual assault, but not necessarily in order. Victims often focus on some specific sensory details from the assault. For example, they may remember specific smells, but not other details. For example, how long the assault lasted or the specific order in which some things happened. These are normal limitations of memory. They're caused by the stress and fear of the traumatic events and how these affect our episodic memory of the who, what and where. Trauma can impact the hippocampus in our brain by shutting down our episodic memory and fragmenting the sequence of events. Trauma specialists and our clients have taught us that human memory and recall don't function like a tape recorder, and that we recall and narrate traumatic events differently than routine events. Also, victims who've experienced drug and alcohol facilitated sexual assault may be unsure about the details of the assault. So it's best practice for sexual assault investigators to conduct only a brief interview when a victim first reports a sexual assault, and then follow up with a fuller interview later when the victim's had time to sleep and consolidate her memories of the traumatic experience. And it's critical for all of us who are responding to not convey any judgment in relation to the victim survivor's remembering of information or how they state that information. But unfortunately, many victim survivors describe reporting as re-traumatising and identify that they experience victim blaming during the process. One of the most re-traumatising aspects is being asked to repeat the details of the assault. So it's important for all responders to be aware of not asking victims to repeat trauma details unnecessarily and not using victim blaming language. Victims of survivors report that police responses are inconsistent, and while some victims do have positive experiences, others describe their contact with police as dismissive, the police lack time, and were disbelieving of their complaint. Victims are often shocked to learn that there's no guarantee of charges being laid, even when they do report to police. Victims report that updates from police are infrequent, and many feel isolated and distressed by a lack of communication about what's happening with the investigation. And in some investigations, the alleged offender is not even being interviewed, which impacts victim survivors very negatively. Here in Victoria, if police decide that there's insufficient evidence to lay charges, victims may receive a generic letter stating that the brief of evidence hasn't been authorised, without even a phone call or an explanation. This is an insensitive way to deliver what's commonly a devastating outcome for victim survivors, and police need to identify more victim-centric methods. So all of these responses can exacerbate victims' trauma. And there's also problematic community expectations that contribute further to this re-traumatisation. So the current default position of mistrust and doubt that we've been talking about of victim survivors is widespread. There are judgments from people that if the victim survivor is telling the truth, she should report to the police immediately, whereas the reality we know is that many victim survivors take years to disclose or never report. There's pressure not to speak out because the reporting will ruin the life or career of the alleged perpetrator or break up the family. So we really need campaigns to educate the community that women who disclose sexual assault are invariably telling the truth. And we also need to increase awareness about the range of settings in which sexual assault occurs. And this must include awareness raising about the prevalence of sexual abuse that occurs within families and as part of family violence, in particular intrafamilial child sexual assault.
Thanks, Heather. Just trying to unmute myself there. Does anyone else want to comment on that? Saxon, would you like to comment on?
Sorry, my mute button was not working. Yeah, I mean, all I can really say is that I totally agree with everything that Heather said, you know, and everything that comes with this. All of it is so loaded, and so, you know, it's hard to judge exactly what a survivor should do, what they should not do, you know. So I think it's really important. And what Heather is saying about, you know, having those support systems all the way through, not just after you've reported to the police. It's not just the justice journey that is traumatizing. You know, from the outset, you need support around those aspects, and I think that's super important.
Great. We're talking about different parts of society. One of the things I guess that the report looked at was at the media and the media's role in reporting of sexual violence, which can often include statements about good character. Kate, do you want to unpack that for us, and the media's role in perpetuating stereotypes and myths?
Thanks, Padma. Yes, in our study, we wanted to explore what the influence of all media reports that tend to focus on the achievements and good character of someone accused of sexual assault, because reading those, it's quite frustrating when you're thinking, well, we're talking about a very serious offence here. Why are we talking about what he did, you know, in his career and his achievements in sporting life, or perhaps? So yes, we explored it in the study, and we were pleasantly surprised to find out that positive reporting on the accused didn't seem to have an impact on mistrusting women's reports. Quite often people would say, why are we hearing about this? This is frustrating. This seems like it's a distraction. And so there wasn't really buying this idea that because he's presented as a good guy, then, you know, that means that she's lying. So that was a positive finding, but a lot of those findings we think were probably more couched in a mistrust of media reporting and a perception that the media might be biased around this. Because in more broader conversation, while people were sceptical of a third-party assessment of good character and were critical of, you know, a newspaper telling me that he's a good guy, they did still draw on the myth of good guys don't rape by considering whether or not he was capable of rape. So thinking about, you know, well, if I knew that he was a good guy really, and I'd made an assessment that he was a decent person, or I knew him well, then maybe I would trust him more than I would trust her. And so we're still feeding on this idea that good guys don't rape, but also a perception that perpetrators are deviant. You know, and like Heather talked about, still focusing perhaps on this idea that sexual assault isn't something that's happening between acquaintances or between someone, you know, someone that a woman knows and trusts. It's still a perception that this is something that's happening. You know, stranger rape is still a pervasive myth. So yeah, there's some positive findings there, that maybe the media focus on the good guy narrative isn't as influential as we think it is, but still a reliance on this idea that, you know, if he's a good guy, he wouldn't do that, and just perhaps overlooking just how common sexual assault is, and the range of settings that it occurs in, and that it is something that happens within intimate relationships, but also between people who trust each other.
Thanks, Kate. Emma, would you like to comment on the media's role in both perpetuating the myths and in helping us change the story?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess, again, it goes to the social context, to trying to understand the social context in which, you know, both men's violence against women arises, and in which these kinds of myths and misconceptions about that violence and distrust of women arise. And, you know, people's individual attitudes don't just arise in a vacuum. People don't just sort of develop these attitudes of mistrust about women, or particular ideas about good guys and bad guys. They don't just coincidentally all just develop these kinds of similar individual attitudes. We develop these attitudes because of persistent social norms and cultural norms that circulate and recirculate and are reinforced in our culture and in our society in hundreds of different ways. And one of the ways, very obviously, is in the media. And when we see media reports that only focus on what she did, or what she was wearing, or what she didn't do, and actually usually make the perpetrator completely invisible. You know, we've seen studies of media reports where the perpetrator is not even mentioned, and certainly his relationship to her is not made visible. So the way in which the media reports this absolutely helps create that focus on women, on women's behaviour, and on what women do or don't do. Again and again, making men, who are the perpetrators of this violence overwhelmingly, completely invisible. So the media is a big part of the problem. It's not the only part. I guess I'd also point to, you know, organisational cultures, government policy, a whole range of structures and systemic issues are also very actively recirculating and reinforcing these ideas and these stereotypes. It's not just the media and popular culture. It happens at lots of different levels, you know, in schools, in workplaces, all sorts of ways. But that also means that these settings are potentially part of the solution. And we do at Our Watch have a focus on positive media reporting of violence against women and working with journalists. We have the Our Watch Awards, which reward good reporting of violence against women and show how journalists can play a role in helping the public to understand that it's not, or it's usually not stranger rape. It's usually a guy that she knew, and it's usually not some deviant perpetrator. It's usually an ordinary guy that you've lived next door to and you had no idea he might do that, because it's very common and it's a highly prevalent issue, and media can help people understand that this is not an anomaly that happens in a shocking, you know, way that makes the front page. It's an everyday experience. It's an experience that makes up part of the experience of many, many women's lives. So the media can really play a role in avoiding the sensationalist anomaly kind of reporting of these incidents and putting them in context as part of a prevalent, very common, everyday social issue. And I suppose the other aspect that I wanted to comment on was this idea about masculinity, man and masculinity, and how these are not just stereotypes about women and women's behaviour and whether women lie or make up stories or whatever, but there's a whole load of quite invisible assumptions about men and masculinity and men's sexuality and what men are like that we need to really interrogate a lot more here. I think they underpin some of these ideas that if he was a good guy, if he was a good neighbor, if he was a good dad, it can't be him. He can't have done this thing, because we think that ordinary masculinity is a positive thing, and this is some kind of deviant men and deviant masculinity, and we don't interrogate enough that actually ordinary masculinity, dominant, socially accepted, expected forms of masculinity in Australia can be quite harmful. They're often based on ideas of power and control and entitlement to sex and hypersexuality. And these are quite everyday standard ideas about masculinity. And if you unpack them, they're very supportive of violence against women. They can lead to violence against women. So we need to start focusing on that kind of everyday masculinity and the stereotypes of that. That the media is one of the ways that those things are perpetuated, yes, but there are many other ways as well. So again, all of those things are important to unpack in terms of a preventative approach and a way of preventing this violence by changing our social norms and our culture and the way that we think about these things.
Mina, do you want to reflect on the media's role in terms of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and men, and the media's expectations or portrayals of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men and women?
I think by and large, Aboriginal women and men are absent from mainstream media reporting. There is, unless it's in regards to potentially offending, or if it's in regards to a death in custody, Aboriginal people aren't presented as victims in that way, and certainly not Aboriginal women. You know, I think, you know, in the last few weeks, there's been a lot of you know, uproar about the way different situations involving either white women or Aboriginal women have been reported when women have gone missing. And, you know, whether we know about an Aboriginal woman going missing and how much reporting there is around that is basically minimal compared to if it's a white woman. And you know, just in the last month, I think we saw a whole lot of news on women missing in the States, but not, sorry, in the United States, but not Aboriginal women missing here. And, you know, obviously in the States, and there's lots of issues about Indigenous women going missing and being murdered and raped there, and not nearly enough done, you know, by the police over there. But, you know, Aboriginal women see the same thing, and it goes back to that experience of who is a victim and who is the ideal victim, and who do we want to support, and who keeps that narrative going of the ideal victim. Because, you know, there's a lot at stake to challenge these ideas about masculinity. You know, if we saw how much, you know, rape and sexual assault happens in society, you know, more and more people would be horrified. But, you know, it's facing up to that idea of that good guy is capable of doing these things. And part of it goes to the way we've been conditioned, and the way, you know, as Emma was saying, the way masculinity is built up and what men feel they're entitled to. And, you know, it's interesting when we talk about reporting of an accused man about, you know, his standing in society, or the concern of what a rape allegation would do to his standing and what he could potentially lose. It speaks volumes about how we value men and how we value women, how we value the accomplishments and the you know, the lives that men have built, what we value in terms of career and money and prestige, those sorts of things. But when it comes to a woman's health and well-being and just generally being safe, that's not nearly as important. And we're quite willing to, you know, it seems that the media is quite willing to vilify that woman in lots of ways, but keep that man standing intact. You know, and for any, you know, it's almost like there's multiple trials that a victim has to go through. You know, trial by media, trial in the legal system, trial by friends and family who they know. It's so unsafe for so many victims to talk about their experiences.
Thanks, Mina. Kate, what do you think? I mean, this is a really, really interesting study, but what do you think the implications are for policy and practice in terms of reform or change?
Myself and other authors put a range of implications together in the report, which I think is accessible through the webinar or online. So I encourage you to look at that to see a more detailed overview of the implications. But I just wanted to touch on 4 key ones quickly today. The first is consent. We talked about it at the beginning, but this has been an area that's been getting a lot of attention. And our study highlighted that there are gaps in knowledge and that this is feeding mistrust. Obviously, those gaps in knowledge are having more severe impacts when it comes to the perpetration of sexual assault, but certainly an implication from this study is that we need improved and consistent consent laws and more education around what consent means. Secondly, empowering women to share their stories. Our study found that first-person accounts from victims and survivors are very trustworthy, increased trust in reports. Women should never be required to have to share their stories in detail to be able to be believed, but we should empower victims and survivors who want to share those stories, in line with the incredible advocacy work of Grace Tame and the Let Her Speak campaign. We need to look at removing legal and other barriers that provide women with opportunities to share their stories if they want to share their stories, because they can be incredibly powerful tools. And again, there shouldn't be an obligation to have to share, but we shouldn't be putting barriers in the way for women to be able to sharing those powerful stories. Thirdly, shifting harmful stereotypes. Literally everything Emma just said. There are some really problematic stereotypes that are being perpetuated through institutions, through the media, and through public spokespeople and leaders. This report identifies the harm that they are doing around mistrust and provides a really good cheat sheet of what not to say and what not to feed into when we talk about sexual assault and when we're talking about victims and survivors. And the last one is just trust women. It's pretty straightforward. We have such high levels of mistrust. They're not founded by the evidence. And then when we try and dig into all the reasons why women aren't trusted and all the reasons that were provided in this study, none of those are supported by the evidence. The reasons that are being provided to mistrust don't stack up either. So what we should do is just trust women. They should be trusted to the legal process. But again, as all the speakers have talked about, there's a lot of informal disclosures that people make to friends and family. And so how they will respond when they're being disclosed to about sexual assault is incredibly important, to trust what a woman has to say. But then also when we talk about sexual assault more broadly, women are listening when people talk about their views on a high-profile sexual assault case or something. And so that affects their ability to feel comfortable about coming forward in the future about their experiences. So just trust women. It's kind of a key takeout of the study, I think.
That's great, Kate. So moving forward, next steps, what should we do with these recommendations and the insights that we've had from the study? What does it tell us we need to be working on? Can I start with you, Saxon?
Yeah, absolutely. There's always, it seems like whenever we sort of have these studies, we find out new things, but the answers are kind of always the same, which is we need age-appropriate early relationships and sexuality education. We need to, instead of just having maybe a 1-hour course that is voluntary, we have actual workplace discussions around sexual violence and domestic violence and those hard topics that people seem to think are inherently political, like masculinity, like consent, those kinds of things. We need to start early, but we need to continue those conversations throughout. It doesn't stop, you don't turn 18, get out of high school and you're done, it's fine. These conversations need to continue because sexual violence continues after that time. And so, that is such a massive aspect of it. And just having those conversations all the time, you know, while we're kind of aiming towards a future where we do have that, we have the appropriate education right away. We're not there yet. So the conversations that we didn't have when we were in high school or primary school or growing up, we didn't have those formative conversations, need to be done now. We can still rectify those, you know, notions of what consent might or might not be, or what masculinity is, or, you know, these mistrusts. We get right to the issue of this whole report. There's still time to dissuade people of those incorrect notions, and having, I mean, conversations like this, but just conversations, you know, with people, you know, with friends and family, specifically men having conversations with men, I think is such a big driver of actual change. You know, when you converse with someone who has these incorrect beliefs, or, you know, that they fall under this mistrust label, you know, having a conversation with a woman is probably not going to dissuade them of their beliefs, but having a conversation with a mate of theirs who says, oh no, I don't think that's right, is so powerful.
Thanks, Saxon. Heather, what do you think the implications are?
Thanks, Padma. Yeah, I just totally agree with everything that Saxon said, but also I suppose you know, mixed conversations. You know, with conversations with you know, males and females present. But I guess in terms particularly of key activities for sexual assault services, I think providing training for health workers and police in trauma-informed practice in responding to victim survivors. That's an ongoing kind of need. As Saxon's mentioned, respectful relationships education. So sexual assault services, you know, play quite a big role in supporting schools to deliver that education. And I think it needs to be not just about the information, about communicative, affirmative and ongoing consent, but also about behaviour change. So it does need to contain opportunities to practice having those conversations about how sexual consent is safely negotiated and how to intervene when witnessing someone at risk of being sexually assaulted, so that those active bystander skills. And I think that third area would be about creating opportunities wherever possible for victim survivors to tell their stories. As has been noted, it's empowering for victim survivors, and it also assists in challenging the mistrust of victim survivors and building empathy for victims. And just as an example, you know, I think consultations of all kinds are good opportunities. And just recently, the Victorian Law Reform Commission has an inquiry going around improving the legal responses to sexual offences. And at our service, we facilitated a number of victims, you know, documenting their stories and submitting those as individual submissions, and also having you know, face-to-face meetings with the Commission, and that was very empowering. So those kind of things, I think, are important.
Mina?
Yeah, I mean, specifically for Aboriginal women, you know, as I said earlier on, there is such distrust of the police, and there's such distrust of so many different services. You know, services need to be at the very least culturally safe for Aboriginal women. They need to understand what the barriers are historically and currently around Aboriginal women making reports and talking about these things. If there's interplay of, you know, there's always going to be on some level an interplay of race and gender in these issues, and it's really important to understand the specific experiences of Aboriginal historically and how that plays out to current contexts and how that's important. You know, I could look really, really big picture and say, you know, we really need to evaluate what our current systems are and our current, you know, the current mechanisms that we have, and say, you know, they've been established with very specific views in mind. They've been established with a dominance of men and with a dominance of white men. So they, you know, are entrenched with certain attitudes, and, you know, empowering different types of decision makers, you know, people with lived experience, you know, supporting people, you know, on that theme of what Saxon and Heather have said about empowering, and also Kate, about empowering survivors to tell their stories, and what it means to support one another through a process like this, and what it means to share that story with someone else and know that you're believed is, it speaks volumes, that connection. So how do we incorporate that connectedness into our systems, into the people that we're engaging with? We see lots of work around peer support roles, people with lived experience supporting other people through systems. We see a lot in mental health. There are ways to support women through these systems that I think means empowering women in so many different ways, not just in terms to tell their story, but to help each other through these processes.
Thank you. And Emma, would you have any final reflections? You did talk about what this means for primary prevention, but are there other lessons that this study gives us in terms of prevention?
Look, I think, both Saxon and Mina have already touched on so many of them. And I think with prevention, it's not there's not a single solution. Prevention is about a whole of population approach. So we need to address the whole of the population, because these are social norms that so many people share and buy into and then actively recirculate. So, as Saxon said, that needs to start young. Of course, it needs to involve respectful relationships education. And we've now got some really good evidence about what best practice looks like in that field. But it needs to not just be about educating young people, it needs to be about working with adults, adult men in all of the circumstances and settings in which they live and work and socialise. We need to hit all of those different settings with different prevention strategies that are suited to the setting and methods of delivering them to different audiences. And that will help engage people at an individual level around individual attitudes and behaviours and those myths and misconceptions. But we also need the sort of structural settings to change. So we need legal change, which is not actually just about improving the response system. It's about changing our social norms about what is acceptable and what there are consequences for in our behaviour. So that also has a kind of knock-on preventative effect at the social norm level. We need government policy settings to be supportive of gender equality and to normalise gender equality and equalising power relationships between the genders and use all of the policy levers that they have for doing that at the sort of structural level. And we talk about this as being gender transformative. So it's not just about recognising gender differences and inequalities and power imbalances. It's actually about actively working to transform those, to transform the society that we know that has given rise to these kinds of beliefs and attitudes in the first place. And the other thing prevention needs to do, and this touches on a lot of what Mina has said, is to be intersectional, because all of these ideas about gender and gender inequality and binary gender stereotypes and so on are intersecting with other ideas about racism, about Aboriginal women, about migrant women, about sex workers, about transgender women. We could go on in the ways in which all of the myths and misconceptions about those groups colliding and intersecting with the sexist attitudes and beliefs to make all of the issues that we've talked about 100 times worse for all of those other groups, and the impact's much more kind of severe and complex. So really important that our prevention efforts are intersectional and that they're take an intersectional gender transformative approach to transforming society. And, it's a really big goal, and, it does sound completely unachievable when you say it like that, but these are deep-seated, entrenched social and cultural beliefs, and they won't be changed with a single program in a single setting. We need this long-term, mutually reinforcing approach across lots of different settings, and using policy levers as well as individual programs and so on in that sort of multifunctional way to achieve this long-term, social change.
But Saxon thinks we can do it, and we can.
Of course we can do
it. We have a great number of questions that have come in, and some great questions. I'll try and get to some of them. We did talk about the legal process a bit, but one of the questions is, are there moments in the legal process where mistrust is more damaging or impactful? So, for example, is it reporting to the police or is it the trial? I might start with you, Mina.
Saxon touched on it earlier that, you know, the very first time that a survivor is telling her story to anyone is going to shape how they how their journey looks. And, you know, the very act of going to a police station and making a statement, and, you know, who you're making the statement to, who you might be with, all of these things are going to, you know, shape, you know, that's the start of a legal process. So that's particularly important to get right, to have people feel that they are believed in that setting. And the thing that is that Heather touched on, that a lot of people aren't clear on, is that the police don't represent the victim, they don't represent the survivor, they represent the state. So, you know, as Heather said, you know, there are people who are going through this process of having, you know, the accused being charged and going through a trial and all the pre-trial proceedings and such, and the survivor can be completely lost in it, and not get the appropriate information, not get the appropriate support, be unprepared for court, for what's happening in court about cross-examination. You know, there's all sorts of rules and such about cross-examination of rape and sexual assault survivors, and you know, it can be a completely alienating process. So there's a lot of work that has to be done along the whole way. But I think also, so I guess the answer is every aspect of the process needs to be looked at, but also, you know, sentencing comments that come from magistrates and judges are really important, because in lots of ways they're meant to be reflecting what the community standards are. And if they're saying things about just all sorts of things that we've heard over the years of you know, from sentencing magistrates and judges about, you know, about how a woman appeared, or, you know, the circumstances, or, you know, anything, it comes with that sort of imprimatur of my dog obviously agrees with this point. I'm really sorry, she's very loud. Yeah, being a judge and a magistrate making those comments, it comes with a certain level of authority that people will attach to. And I'm going to stop talking now so you don't hear my dog.
That's fine. I'm surprised mine hasn't started barking during this session. Sorry, I'm just reading some of the comments that we've got. We've got a question for you, Kate. How did the research team come up with the hypothetical sexual violence scenarios that were provided to participants?
So we drafted those as part of the methodology design, and it was based on looking at some of the existing research that had used vignettes in sexual assault research is quite common. But so looking at kind of the way that they've been represented in other research, but also trying to provide representations of what would be a realistic disclosure of sexual assaults, but also reflecting some of the ways that it's presented in the media. So the two vignettes, the first one we used was a hypothetical newspaper article that was reporting on a sexual assault, and was modelled off existing newspaper reports that we've seen, and so a bit of an amalgamation of those. And then the second was about a woman providing a first-person disclosure of sexual assault to friends. So that was, again, drafted taking into account what that might look like, based on the existing research that we'd be able to find.
Thanks. For Saxon and potentially Mina as well, the question is about how best we can ensure law reform actually makes a difference. Even though we have a positive definition of consent, and in New South Wales courts should consider what steps the accused took to ascertain consent, the court process stubbornly remains focused on the victim's actions. How do we make sure affirmative consent reform meaningfully changes this?
Yeah, it is hard to say, you know, obviously affirmative consent is a really necessary change in the law, but changing one aspect of something doesn't, you know, just get rid of the whole problem entirely. So there, if the New South Wales bill passes, there will be a 6-month lead time to ensure education for judicial officers and police and things, but that is very rarely perfect. Or I would say very rarely even good enough. So I think education resources for the justice system as a whole is really important if they're going to be implementing this change. But again, I mean, I'm just going to say the same thing I say every time, but again, it comes down to that, like that education starting right away. Like it's doable, but it's hard to change minds, 30 years hence. So making sure that as a society, it's not just, okay, the law has changed. Our understanding of consent is changing with that. And making sure that everyone is on the same page. And, like Mina has said, it is a reflection of our society, those views that they hold. And so making sure that we are actually making those changes and having those conversations to get to that end. And I think the thing with affirmative consent is it is it's an easy thing to wrap your head around, just making sure that the person you want to be with wants to be with you. But I think also in an even bigger sense, it's like reevaluating how you sort of think about sex. If sex is just like you're trying to get to destination A and that's kind of it, not only is you're probably not going to have the best time, the person you're with is not going to have the best time. Like sexual act should be this, whether it be intimate or fun or whatever you want it to be. Having those conversations should really enhance that experience. It's not taking away from anything. It's enhancing the joy that you're both engaging in. And so it's important to view it in that way when we're talking about it. So then that's what filters into our justice system, is that view that this is what sex is. And, when you go outside of that, that is when you are committing those sexual violent acts.
Great. Did you want to comment, Mina?
Oh,
No?
Absolutely agree. And, with regards to training and such, we're talking about changing attitudes, that have been entrenched for a really long time. And the law is a slow thing. Like, the law takes time. So, as Emma said, it's about the prevention before we even get to that point, is a really big part of it. The law is only supposed to really come in when things go wrong. So if we can prevent things from going wrong in the first place, it should be, not many situations having to come to that end point.
Yeah, and it's also incredibly important symbolically, I guess, the law. Sorry, Heather, you wanted to make a point.
Yeah, I just thought I might just jump in and say, I wonder if victims also had their own legal representation in courts, whether that might, support the laws and the judiciary to actually enact the intent of the laws. So that's something to think about.
Yeah, victims are witnesses in a court process, and that's a very strange concept to get across to many victim survivors. Another question that we have is that sexual violence almost always gets lumped in with domestic and family violence when it's a very separate issue. How can policymakers ensure this doesn't happen when working on sexual violence prevention and response? Shall I start with Emma?
Yeah, sure. And it's interesting the different language that's used. I think at Our Watch we use the language of violence against women because it's an all-encompassing concept. It gets across that this is a highly gendered issue. It includes sexual violence, it includes family violence, it includes intimate partner violence, it includes workplace sexual harassment. Now, all of those forms of violence can be separate and individual, that can be experienced by one person all at the same time. And a domestic or intimate partner violence relationship can include sexual violence, very often does include sexual violence. But sexual violence can also happen in a dating context that is not domestic or family. It's two young people dating when they just met each other 3 weeks ago. It happens in all sorts of contexts. And so that's why we try to use the phrase violence against women to convey that all of these forms of violence are related. They're on a spectrum and they're all driven by some similar drivers. Obviously, when it comes to sexual violence, there is research that shows that men who hold particular kinds of gendered attitudes and particular forms of masculinity are more likely to perpetrate sexual violence. But those are sort of subsets of gender inequality more broadly and of the social context that is giving rise to all of these forms of violence against women, whether it's sexual violence, physical violence, coercive control, workplace sexual harassment, and so on. And so we're keen, I guess, to lift up, to have a look at the debate from that level. And I guess I'd also point out that from an international human rights perspective, that's the term that is more common, violence against women, or often violence against women and girls, to convey again that this is a gendered phenomenon that we're talking about. That's not to say that it isn't legitimate to look at sexual violence as its own specific form of violence, but again, that is probably the form of violence that is most overwhelmingly perpetrated by men. You know, the thing that defines sexual violence is actually men's perpetration of it. And so again, from a prevention perspective, we need to be talking a lot more about men and about the perpetration of sexual violence, about who is perpetrating that in what circumstances, and what it is about men and masculinity that leads to the phenomenon that is men's perpetration of sexual violence, rather than always focusing on women's experiences of it, important though that is. So I guess that's the way I'd like to see the debate flipped a little bit more, and the language around violence against women being used as an umbrella term that can help convey the gendered nature of that experience. And, you know, taking that one step further, maybe we should be talking about men's violence, full stop, rather than violence against women, because that's a term that also makes the perpetrator invisible. So, you know, we should actually be talking about men's violence a lot more, I think, and we're trying to do that a lot more in our language.
Heather, did you want to comment on that from a service perspective, and then I'll come to you, Saxon?
Yeah, I just was recalling, because I think we did, there was a period where we were sort of using that phrase, you know, male violence against women a lot more, and I think then there might have possibly been a bit of a backlash, and the language changed again. But I mean, obviously, just to I guess just to note, you know, that our services do also support male victims of sexual assault, and you know, but to note that whilst obviously it is largely perpetrated by men against women, those situations where boys and men are impacted is again the situation of power. You know, where men have usually exerted, predominantly men have exerted power over particularly male, you know, boys and men, that they could do so. I think it's an interesting question because sexual assault is both a separate issue, but simultaneously at the same time a considerable amount of sexual assault occurs in the context of family violence, so intimate partner violence, and as I've mentioned, intrafamilial child sexual assault. And the NSASAV, the National Sexual Assault Peak, feels very positive about the language that was used at the Women's Safety Summit recently, where politicians committed to a future free from family and domestic violence and sexual assault. We've advocated strongly for inclusion and specific naming of sexual violence. But I think it requires ongoing advocacy to ensure that the policymakers routinely include sexual violence in all key policies and reports. And I would go so far as to suggest that we need a separate sexual violence prevention action plan as part of the next national plan, in recognition of the extent and prevalence of sexual assault, which occurs, as we've highlighted, across the lifespan and across virtually all domains of women's lives: family, education, workplace, by health practitioners, in sporting and faith-based organisations, care facilities, and even by our political representatives.
Saxon.
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think, you know, while there are like many of the same drivers, I think it is important to view sexual violence sometimes on its own. My organisation, Rasara, we deal specifically and only with sexual violence, not domestic violence, because I think sometimes it does get sort of swept up into that, and including, you know, even when we're talking about like the national plan or funding from government grants, where we're being overwhelmed with the need to research and create prevention for domestic violence, which is obviously an incredibly important topic, but it sometimes then shrinks the outputs that we have for those sexual violence responses. And so, you know, we sort of get lost in, while they do sometimes, you know, quite often go hand in hand, they also don't, and we need to sort of view those aspects as different things. You know, it is, sexual violence is kind of hard to talk about as well, and so you know, even in New South Wales, our Minister for the Prevention of Domestic Violence removed sexual assault off of their title for a time, and said, you know, it wasn't to do with anything, it just was cleaner that way. But you know, we're now silencing that aspect of that role. And, you know, that, while might seem small, has an effect on how those resources are used and where we put our money and our research and our time.
Yeah, and it seems to be linked to what you were talking about before, this sort of shame around even talking about sex. There's another question, Kate, for you on methodology. Were research participants who responded to the vignettes men, women, and gender diverse, or men only? If different genders were included as participants, were there noticeable differences between the genders in their attitudes?
So we had both men and women participate in the study. Because of the study size, we didn't have a broader range of gender diverse people necessarily included in our sample space. But we had focus groups with men and women separately, and that was because the research had told us they're more likely to be a bit more open talking about sexual assaults when they're in single gender groups. And the findings were consistent in some ways across the genders, but generally we were seeing more mistrust among men more broadly. And particularly as part of the study, we also looked at how people might respond if someone they know was accused of sexual assault. And certainly for men, they were more inclined to refer to trusting a friend's account over hearing an accused account. But those findings are also reflected more broadly in the NCAS survey, where we are seeing that on attitudes around violence against women, men have more areas in which they can improve some of those attitudes than women generally.
Great, thank you. How do we respond to the people who hold false beliefs? I guess that's false beliefs about women. Should I start with Kate? What did the research tell us that we need to do in terms of people who have false beliefs?
So in the research, we asked people what proportion they thought of allegations were false. So trying to understand or quantify, you know, what they thought a false allegation was. And so the numbers we were being told ranged from about 0 to about 30%, sometimes a bit higher, around, you know, people thought that many allegations were false, which isn't supported by the evidence. But in those conversations, it was really interesting that we then distilled down and tried to understand what made an allegation false. And that was quite interesting because it really unraveled a lot of these perceptions people had around false allegations in some ways, because no one could actually name what made it false. There was an understanding that if a charge isn't laid, that doesn't mean it's false. You know, if it's found, if someone's accused of sexual assault and found not guilty by a court, that doesn't mean they're innocent. That means they're not guilty, or perhaps the evidentiary threshold couldn't be met. Even when it came to reporting, it doesn't, you know, that women were not trusted as much if they didn't make a report, but that didn't mean that it was false. And so we found that even though people were able to tell us, oh, I think 20% of allegations are false, they then couldn't back that up with what made something false. And so it really started to unravel what that meant. So I think in terms of how we address these kinds of things is challenging ideas and throwaway lines of saying women lie. Well, tell me more about that. What do you think they're lying about? You know, what makes you so sure? Because no one could tell us what would make them certain that a woman was lying. There was just no way to prove that she was lying, which seemed to be a bit of a conundrum, I guess, for them, because they were also obsessed with wanting to prove that she wasn't lying. So some people got a bit stuck. But I think challenging those perceptions front on is a good way of handling it, and actually asking people to unpack what they mean when they say these things.
Great. We've only got a couple of minutes left. Might just move to you all just for final reflections. Emma, I'll start with you.
Sure. Yeah, look, I think people have covered a lot of the main points that I'd make. I think just congratulations to ANROWS. This is really, well, look, it's very depressing research. I think it, it confirms a lot of the things that we unfortunately know are entrenched in our culture and that are part of the problem in driving violence, particularly sexual violence. But it is incredibly valuable research because I think partly a lot of the things Kate was just saying in her last answer, that when you dig into and you try to unravel and unpack some of these beliefs, they start to sort of disintegrate before your eyes, because they are based on so many kind of understandings and misconceptions and stereotypes that just can't actually be backed up by people. So I think there's an insight there into the work that needs to be done to try and help people unpack some of the things that they're taking for granted and some of the ideas that they have that are colouring their understandings of this, and to look at how those are playing out in their own beliefs and behaviours, but also particularly for men, I think, to be talking to each other and to be trying to start to challenge each other about the kinds of ideas that they have about women. I think that's what we need to see a lot more of, in addition to all the prevention strategies I talked about before that need to happen, across society. But yeah, just thank you, I guess, for this research. I think it's incredibly useful.
Thank you, Emma. Mina.
Yeah, no, thanks for inviting me to be part of this panel, but I think it just really highlights just how much of a role every single person has in changing attitudes and how important it is to call out those minor things in conversations around, gender inequality, racial inequality, ableism, all of these things that contribute to these ideas that there are certain people who are better or certain people who have more power over others. And, all of these issues are interconnected. And I think if we, every single one of us is responsible, not just those of us who work in these spaces specifically, but, we're talking about attitudes that are held widely in community. And, it can be a difficult conversation, but it's really important. And, being believed is so important as part of a healing process, and being able to be heard and recognized for your experience. And it's just such important work that we're all engaged in. So just thank you for having me on the panel.
Thank you, Mina. Heather.
Yeah, I think that's my key message too. Believe victims, listen to them, and find out, how you can support them with what they want to happen. And I think, we all kind of have hopefully sort of, kind of bought into that idea about, if we hear someone, making a sexist joke, that we should, we should say something. You feel okay to say something. I think the same, if the same were true around every time we hear someone make a victim blaming statement, that would start to kind of propel some of the change. But thanks, great conversation. Thanks for being part of it.
Thanks, Heather. Saxon.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I love conversations like this, and I think, this report is so important because, like we've all said, we know this stuff, but it's good to have it sort of just plainly written out there. And I think what Kate was saying was a great point. Like, when you actually drill down into the mistrust, there isn't a lot of truth under it. There isn't a lot of fact under it. It's just a misconception. And so the more that we work to get rid of that, the less we will have of initial doubt of that first report or that first, disclosure being a positive enough experience and being a safe environment rather than the fear of being not believed or not trusted. But yeah, amazing conversation. Thank you so much.
It has been an amazing conversation, and I suspect we could keep talking about this for many hours, but we've come to the end of our time, and I really wanted to thank each one of you. It's been such a rich conversation, and we've covered so much ground, and we've also had an amazing audience who has stayed with us for our hour-and-a-half conversation, so thank you. Just as I wrap up, the webinar recording, as I said at the start, will be available on the ANROWS website soon. Tell your colleagues if they didn't manage to get to the webinar. And don't forget, as you exit, you will have a little quick survey to provide us with our feedback. And for any researchers tuning in today, if you're working on projects that address violence against women, you can submit it to ANROWS Register of Active Research, the RA, on the ANROWS website. It's a centralised and publicly available database of research on violence against women that's currently underway, and I think it's a really good resource. It helps us work out where the gaps are, but it also helps us coordinate where more work's needed. So thanks everyone. I'm Padma Raman, and on behalf of ANROWS, thank you and goodbye.